In 1993, a Montreal Canadiens team defeated Wayne Gretzky and the Los Angeles Kings to win the Stanley Cup and bring it back to Canada. But ever since that moment, it hasn't returned. More than 3 decades have passed, and with some of the 7 Canadian franchises coming agonizingly close, the Stanley Cup has never returned north of the border. And in recent years, teams in places like Florida, Nevada, and Texas have become some of the NHL's model organizations, attracting stars, building dynasties, and winning championships. All while it is becoming a trend for superstars to want out of Canada entirely. So what exactly has changed? Why has the country that lives and breathes hockey struggled to convince some of the world's best players to call it home? Well, let's take a deeper look. Now, before we continue, today's video is sponsored by our good friends over at SeatGeek. We're in the dog days of the offseason, but the MLB season is still going. You can get tickets for that. And the NHL recently announced their schedule for the 26-27 season, where tickets are already available on SeatGeek. They also have tickets for concerts, shows, any live event. SeatGeek has got you covered. When you check for tickets, you browse seating on a scale of 1 to 10. Look for the green. That's a great deal. You snatch those up and voila, you have tickets for an unreal price. They are the best by hooking us up as well. Just use code HOCKEY2026 for 10% off your next pair of tickets. All you gotta do is download the app or click it on the link below. It'll automatically apply the code to your account and you're ready to go with the deal. Get started, use the code, and enjoy your next game on a great deal using SeatGeek. Over the last few years in the NHL, there's been a trend that has seen Southern teams have massive amounts of success and win championships. Combine that with players leaving Canadian markets for all kinds of reasons, that has created this narrative that majority of NHL players, especially Americans, don't want to play in Canada. This trend in recent years has been a movement that is very hard to ignore. The list of players that have opted to leave Canadian markets is getting longer and longer. Matthew Tkachuk, Johnny Gaudreau, Nikolai Ehlers, Jacob Trouba, Mitch Marner, Quinn Hughes, and the latest being Brady Tkachuk. It has become a trend, and the reasons why grow every day. Fans point to taxes, others blame the relentless media, and some argue it's simply about winning. But the truth is, all three are connected. Since 1993, the league has expanded and changed drastically. The salary cap era was introduced, and the formula for building winning teams have simply evolved. In the last few years specifically, Southern teams have had that winning formula down pat. 6 of the last 7 Stanley Cup winners are Southern teams. And before Carolina won the Cup this past season, the Florida Panthers were the golden example to the league that taxes, income, and overall lifestyle are a factor for NHL players. Before the 25-26 season started, the Panthers faced the daunting task of trying to re-sign Marchand, Bennett, and Ekblad with limited cap space in the days following their second straight Stanley Cup. So GM Bill Zito said, watch this. He got Bennett at an 8x8, who just came off winning a Conn Smythe trophy. And then he completed an 8-year, $48.8 million deal with Ekblad, alongside a 6-year, $31.5 million contract for Brad Marchand. Of course, Marchand couldn't help himself and said what everyone already knew. The weather is nothing to complain about, and he confirmed that, yes, the fact that Florida has no state income tax simply doesn't hurt.
If we were not in a non-tax state, it wouldn't have worked out probably for 2 guys. 2 guys probably would have been leaving in that situation. So that's a benefit that this team has that, we were able to utilize and make work.
Now, taxes don't work how you think in the NHL. Each player pays something called jock taxes. Now, I'm not an accountant, numbers hurt the brain, so I'll keep it relatively simple. But jock taxes are income taxes that professional athletes may owe in states, provinces, or cities where they play games outside of their primary home jurisdiction. So if you play for the Leafs, you got 41 home games in Toronto, which you're taxed on. But anytime you play on the road, you're taxed in those places as well. So every time you're required to be in one of those places for a game, practice, travel, or another team obligation, those are called duty days. A portion of your salary is assigned to each jurisdiction based on how many duty days you spend there. So states like Florida, Texas, and Nevada don't have state income tax. That means if you're a member of a Southern team, your home games don't require you to pay state income tax. But when you travel to places like California or New York, you still owe jock taxes in those places. So players on the Florida Panthers don't avoid all state taxes, but they do get a break on the portion of their income earned in Florida. It's not this massive advantage, but it is an advantage, as our boy Bradley alluded to. Of course, Gary is not a fan of this narrative at all. He's gone far enough to say that it's a ridiculous issue, and his reasoning actually does make a good point. When he was on the TNT panel, he had to say this: when the Florida teams weren't good, which was about for 17 years, nobody said anything about it. For those of you who played, were you sitting at the tax table? No. You wanted to go to a good organization and a place where you wanted to live, where you want to raise your kids and send them to school. You want to play in a first-class arena with a first-class training facility, with an owner, an organization, a GM, and a coach that you were comfortable with. And honestly, Gary makes a great point. I remember when the Florida Panthers had just Stevie Weiss and Olli Jokinen, and nobody wanted to go near that shit. It was those guys and maybe a few thousand players in the arena, and no one wanted to go near Florida hockey. And so that brings us to reason number 2 as to why more NHL players would prefer not to play in Canada, and it's because of winning. This is where the whole situation becomes one giant chicken or the egg scenario. For almost every player, ultimately at the end of the day, what they want most is to win. Players want to play for teams that are well-run, competitive, and capable of winning the Stanley Cup. An NHL player's career is short, and once a player has made enough money to secure his future, the opportunity to win can become more valuable than maximizing every last dollar of his contract. But here's the problem. The teams that players want to join are often the teams that already have these slight tax advantages. A winning culture attracts players, but those players are also what helped create the winning culture in the first place. Before the Panthers became one of the NHL's model franchises, they were hardly considered a premier destination. But once the organization established a winning culture and built a strong core that began consistently competing for the Stanley Cup, the perception around the franchise changed completely. Suddenly, veterans were willing to join. Players were willing to take discounts for the opportunity to win. Florida and these other states with no income taxes make that decision even easier, because taking less on paper does not necessarily mean taking home less money. Again, you can see this if you go to the website jocktaxes.com. You can compare what a contract is in both Canada and the United States, and how if you have the same dollar figure, how much more the player takes home if they're in a no income tax state. So if you have a contract that's worth $12.5 million AAV, your $12.5 million would go a lot further in a tax-free state as opposed to you playing in Canada. Add in the opportunity to play on a proven contender, live in a desirable market, and avoid some of the pressure associated with playing in Canada, and the decision becomes even more enticing. That right there is the cycle. A Canadian team may have to spend more of its limited cap space to provide a player with the same financial value that a tax-free team can offer for less. And so Southern American markets have created a positive loop. Winning attracts good players, and good players make winning easier. A tax advantage helps those players take less money without necessarily sacrificing as much in take-home pay. That makes it easier to retain the winning core, and the more a team wins, the more attractive it becomes to the next player. This cycle becomes even more complicated when a high-profile player decides that he wants out of his current situation. Most NHL players eventually acquire some form of no-trade protection. Whether that's a full no-movement clause or a modified no-trade clause, it gives a player the ability to influence where he can be traded. Now, this isn't just an issue for Canadian teams, by the way, as we're seeing it play out in real time with the Dylan Larkin situation. Larkin, still with term on his contract, wants to win right now, and so he handed Detroit a trade list that includes 4 teams. 3 out of those 4 teams on his list are southern states with no income tax. However, then you have the Brady Tkachuk situation. Tkachuk had a no-movement clause, meaning that he had significant control of where he could be sent. According to Ottawa's general manager Steve Staios, Tkachuk provided a short list of teams he would be willing to join. And Staios was blunt about the situation, saying clearly it was pointed at one team, and that team was Florida, which almost seemed inevitable with his brother being a massive part of the Panthers' core. This has become a trend for superstars lately, as using their no trade and no movement clauses to not only leave Canadian teams, but to also block the possibility of going to one at all. Of course, Team USA and the players that have won gold have been getting a lot of flack for this, as anyone a part of that team now has the itch to win and be a part of a winning culture.
It's like, no, I've won. Now I want to win more. I know what it's like to win this gold medal, and I want that for the Stanley Cup.
But there's one other big reason that has been the talking point for quite some time, and that is the last one, which is pressure. This may be the most obvious difference between playing in a Canadian hockey market and playing in many American markets. Taylor Hall has experienced both sides of it. He began his career as a first overall pick in Edmonton, and before winning a Stanley Cup in Carolina this past season, they asked him about the difference between playing in a market like Raleigh and playing for a Canadian team.
It's definitely easier in a place like Raleigh. It's a lot different once you cross the border in the U.S. The fans are still the same during the game. There's sellouts and they go crazy for the hockey, but I think away from the game, on social media, in the media, is just a little bit different in Canada. And I think if you look at a team like the Green Bay Packers in the NFL, that's what it's like to play, for a Canadian team.
That is telling from a former first overall pick. Of course, the most popular and recent example of this is Mitch Marner with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Marner was one of the most productive superstars in the regular season for the Leafs, but as the team constantly fell short to advance deeper in the playoffs, with him struggling to perform in elimination games, the noise around Marner got louder and louder as the relationship between him and the fan base deteriorated. Eventually, it got to the point where you could see the pressure visibly disrupt his game. And when it came time to move on, it was well documented from Marner himself just how much the pressure and scrutiny impacted him and his family. Once he moved to Vegas, he didn't have his best regular season, but he did have the best playoff performance of his career. A Conn Smythe level run that saw him thrive in elimination games and lead the playoffs in scoring en route to a Stanley Cup final. That certainly didn't help the narrative whatsoever. Of course, the media pressure isn't solely focused on just the play of players either. After Team USA won gold, the celebrations left a poor taste in the mouth of Canadian markets. Everything took a political turn, and American captains coming back to their Canadian teams faced backlash for those celebrations. Of course, we know how that played out with Ottawa and Tkachuk, and with uncertain situations surrounding the long-term future of players like Austin Matthews for the Leafs and Connor Hellebuck for the Jets, there is some concern as to what happens next for fans of Canadian teams. That being said, the pressure that may deter some players is also what drives others. You could argue that Connor McDavid has the most pressure out of anyone in the entire league. He's a one-of-a-kind player without a championship in the prime of his career. He's playing in not just one of the biggest Canadian markets in the NHL, but one of the biggest, period. Yet despite that, he has so far made the conscious decision to stay and did so on a team-friendly discount. Although his future is up in the air 2 years from now, and he could very well join the long list of players that choose to go play in the United States for the best chance to win, McDavid has shown with his past contracts that money or pressure comes nowhere close to the same level of importance that winning does. And so it's easy for Canadian fans to hate the players like the Tkachuk brothers or Quinn Hughes for leaving their franchise in no man's land. But it's a sign that the dynamic between players and management is indeed changing. For decades, NHL teams held the leverage and asked players to be loyal and commit on long-term deals that locked them up for large portions of their prime and career. That paradigm, though, has now changed entirely to where star players and their agents recognize that they hold the cards, especially with how they can manipulate no-move clauses to force teams into tough spots. Combine these three factors, and there's legitimate reason for players to choose an American market over a Canadian one. And as the uncertainty grows around particular superstars around the league, this trend will be monitored and examined closely. For Canadian teams, the best way to overcome all of this is still the same as it's always been. Build a team so good that the players believe playing there is worth everything else. But right now, that is a lot easier said than done. So, what do you think of this whole topic? If you were an NHL player and had the choice, where would you want to play and why? Let me know in the comments down below. I'm Anthony. I do all the breakdowns for the channel. If you want to stay up to date on all things NHL and dive deeper into the biggest moves, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so that you don't miss a single thing.